This is Mary Claire Bristois. I'm the Executive Director of the Technology and Applied Composition Program at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. I'm coming to you live from Zoom with all my students here in the classroom with me, and we are very excited today to host our guest of honor who's going to give us a masterclass, Austin Wintory. Austin is an American composer who composes scores for film and video games. He's particularly known for composing the scores to the acclaimed titles Flow and Journey, the latter of which was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Score Soundtrack for Visual Media, a historical honor. Austin has come to visit us for several years now. We also staged Journey live with our orchestra at the conservatory several years back, and we're just really grateful for his ongoing support of our students. He brings tremendous wisdom, value, and as you'll soon find out, comedic gifts to his teaching, and he is definitely a fan favorite, so we're really glad he's here today. Austin, take it away.
Well, thank you, I think, for that, that intro. As has been mentioned to everyone prior to this stream, given that the whole point of this is to be useful to the students, in fact, let me make sure that the chat is kind of perpetually handy. I like to make this interactive and try to make this sort of pedagogically useful, we'll say, as possible. And so everybody is thoroughly encouraged to jump in with questions, to stop me if I'm saying anything confusing, or just ask something that has the potential to take us out of nowhere, off in a totally different direction. I'm certainly no stranger to, and indeed a fan of, wild tangents. So with that said, I thought I would look under the hood at some stuff. I don't really know why Digital Performer is giving me grief. Certainly, Torin, if you think of a magic bullet solution, I'm happy to try it. We won't spin our wheels too much on it, but I'm happy to do that. I thought I would start by, I just last year shipped a game that I was in the 1 year ago now, I was in the process of finalizing the recordings of this score that I've been working on for several years. That's called Erica, which was technically one of the most ambitious and difficult I'd ever attempted before because it was extremely interactive. The game plays like a movie, and so meaning they shot actual actors on sets with props and costumes and a digital cinematographer and blah, blah, blah. The result of which is that when playing the game, it feels very much like you're watching a film, except that it's constantly getting you to do things. And in fact, I can show a little teaser. Let me just see if this will not give us the same problems as before. Oh wait, wrong file. It's always the dangers of the screen share. You see the incompetent, also wrong file. There we go. Here's just a little taste of what it looks like. You can just see, this is a thing I'd put on my YouTube channel, but you can see this is a video that interweaves some of the recording session process with actual footage of the gameplay, and you can see it absolutely is filmic in the truest sense. was recorded in the illustrious Wintory Global Engineering scoring stage. Backgrounds of that clip might look very similar to the backgrounds of where I'm sitting right now. They're like homebrew operations. The idea. So I thought what I would do is the main theme of that is what I have open on my screen, and then I can show some other stuff. And so you heard a little taste of it just then in the video, but just for absence of doubt, here's kind of pounds. Actually, what I can do is I can for all of us nerds, I can pull the piano roll onto that and just kind of wing it. So the first thing I'm going to point out is you see these chords here that kind of sounded like a giant guitar. I have two different string orchestras that we used in this score because I really wanted the traditional string orchestra, but also this ensemble that's all basses that we recorded in Nashville. And so if I isolate, which I would be doing in DP if I could, the basses, I believe that's on this stem. Yeah. You hear my six, I would do a lot of 5 and 6 voice chords, like in this case, pizzicato. But then you can see them here. The audio of that coming through okay? Oops, I hit play in DP by mistake. Is that clear? Is that not sounding garbled as it was before, I assume? Torin, you want to give me a thumbs up if it's not garbage? Or anybody? I see. Okay. Good. Yeah, all right. The problem is it only shows me a couple of your faces at a time. So I have to constantly change the. Oh, wait a minute. I just discovered a way to get a giant panoply of smiling and or suspicious looking faces. All right. Now I can more efficiently get thumbs up. So yeah, so you can hear, I've always loved the sound of like cello ensemble or bass ensemble. And in this case, part of the directive from the game director was to, he just wanted it to just be heavy all the time. And so I thought, well, bass ensemble. So there's a lot of cues that have this. One of the wonderful things about that kind of lineup is, only 5 or 6 people sound so huge and rich, especially if it's, written one to a part in that way. And then obviously I had also the, let me get this here. I had also the string gesture at the beginning. I thought as a little insight into how the orchestrational process works, I tend to write out a piece where anything that I can't mock up easily, I tend to get kind of lazy and just immediately I don't even try. I do something that's even remotely close to it. And then I'll leave a note to the orchestrator to say, this is precisely what that should be. So the very opening gesture that you heard there, this should be in this stem. Wait for it. Nothing too complicated, but it's basically just this chord of trills that glisses down. You can see here, I wrote strings, sforzando attack, then quick diminuendo and glissando down while trilling. Note that first violin is a half step and violin and violas are both trilling a whole step. So it's like, I didn't even bother trying to make the mock-up do that. It's just so much work. It's hours of work to do something that the musicians can do after 5 seconds of explanation. And fortunately, it's not the kind of dynamic with the game's director that if it's not precisely correct in the mock-up, they're going to go, what the hell is this, when the final recording comes in, because it's some bizarre thing they've never heard before. And that's a function of, you know, building up that, obviously, that relationship. And you know, it depends also how featured a gesture like that is. And then I figured, while I'm here, I can show you how the final score looked. Theme, this should be it. Yeah, okay. So there you go. Very, very simple and pretty much exactly as I just described. And sometimes what happens is my orchestrator, Susie, she'll send over a part and I wouldn't have been quite clear or send over a score rather, and it's not quite clear. Or I prior to that was not very clear. And so it's not, I look at it on the page and I say, that's not actually what it's supposed to be. Like, for example, in fact, this may even be what happened here. I want them to trill for a full bar before the gliss starts. Well, if memory serves, it may have been one that the gliss started instantly on the downbeat. So it's just boom, right out of the gate instead of the trill and then the gliss. And so, you know, that's the kind of thing where I would just mark the PDF. I have an iPad and a little stylus where I just make a red mark and I send it back and say, actually, starting on bar 5. And you see also something that came up earlier today in the one-on-one discussion is that you'll notice this is the string score. But I have a separate chart completely for the bass ensemble score because they were recorded on different continents on different days. And there's no point in having them all on one because the conductor at any given time is not dealing with both ensembles. And I'm a big fan of just relying on the prelays and relying on my ears in what it sounds like is slight distinction from my friend Mr. Tim Davies, who I guess had other thoughts on that subject. And you know, let's look at his body of work and his career. He clearly doesn't know what he's doing, and so feel free to dispense with his advice and use only mine. And so yes, spaces only on this score, and strings only on this one. And then half the time, if I'm being very transparent and honest here, like the cellist Tina coming in, you could hear her solos. Let me see if I have the right. Here's her stem. Usually when I'm tracking someone here in my studio, I don't even make a part. I literally, DP I'll just, here, I'm back into this here. I'll literally just go, okay, here's Tina. We'll open up this. Yeah, okay, good enough. And I will export this PDF and mark up the articulations and dynamics and things on my iPad, and then she'll just play it straight off the iPad. Partly because I printed so many freaking thousands of sheets of paper over the years for a 5-second use, especially because in this cue, for example, notice that there is a brief moment of, where is it? I got my bars in deep. I have a lot of greasy, pitch bendy saxes. You can see it right here in the MIDI. So here's his part. Very exciting, and well worth the piece of paper it gets printed on, I can tell you. So also note that it's, you know, there's no indication of any glisses or anything. I have to always communicate that directly or write it on by hand. And that's what I used to always do, is literally print it an hour before the musician comes, get out a pen, mark all that stuff up. And then while they're playing, I'm reading off of the piano roll as my score, and I'm not even reading the notes. And so every now and again, they'll ask me a question. They'll say, "Do you really want piano here?" And I'll go, "Is that what I marked?" And I'll have to lean over and go and check and see what mark I made, because sometimes I did things so hastily. But this gives you a sense. I wish I could play. Actually, I may be able to, just for comparison, if you're curious. here was, since we don't usually get this opportunity. So there you have the cello, Tina, of course, being accompanied primarily by the bass ensemble with a little bit of piano and some other very, very gentle, soft electronics. You can hear, I can play you the mock-up of that. You can get a sense of just how lazy or not that I am. So for me, the bass ensemble accompaniment here sounds like garbage. I don't even hear it. It's just kind of, it sounds like a low synth. Cello sample is at least semi-passable, and the reason why is that it's Tina's actual library. So I'm just kind of replacing robo guo with cello guo, as we like to say. And actually, I shouldn't have stopped it, because at least one of the big differences is the you'll notice if you also look here at the mock-up, I've got the full strings coming in here, and the solo violin initially playing in unison with the first violins in the orchestra, which is something I love to do. I love to track a soloist so that I can kind of tug a given section out in front, and it was just kind of like sweetening a mock-up, except that it's actually different from that. But then also, you'll notice right around bar 43, she actually splits off and starts performing a counterline, and it's basically totally inaudible in the mock-up because I hate the violin samples so much that I was just like, I'm not even going to subject them to this. Notice how impossible it was to hear the violin doing the, whereas if I play this. As a quick side note, you'll also notice, by the way, I'm always an advocate of writing my parts for very specific people. It's not cello solo, it's Tina solo. It's not violin solo, it's Caroline Campbell solo. And occasionally I have to break that because I'm not entirely sure who might be available. And I think that's the only one, because I also have in this one the, like Ian, my guy Ian played all the saxes. Originally, I wasn't even going to be, I was going to be tracking all this. You can see the original template had a very different situation going on I never deleted those tracks, but originally I was going to have 3 bass flutes, 3 contrabassoons, 3 tenor saxes as my wind, and the rest are just placeholder there. And all that went to hell. Needless to say, I wrote a lot of drafts that got rejected. Don't let the don't let the version 1A fool you. That's a bald-faced lie. But the folder and folder of pre-version 1 themes is speaks the full truth there. But so you get the sense like there were a lot of little things. Well, I think I just heard feedback of myself for a second. Or did somebody try to say something? Silence shall mean no, we are getting all the information our brains could possibly ask for. I hope not, actually. A little thing I wanted to highlight as an example that just because it's worth thinking about in practical terms, you'll notice that, or you may not have noticed, there was some inner voice movement, which is something I always do. It's basically totally inaudible in the mock-up because, again, laziness. I hate spending my time on it when I know I'm going to record it and there's other cues to write and I have, finite hours in my life. It's really hard to justify spending all that time making the mock-up sound as real as possible when a month from now or 2 months from now or 6 months from now, it's going to all be replaced with live instruments. The only time I ever really go nuts with the mock-up is if we're hitting a roadblock and I just can't seem to get them to approve it. And I've, through our conversation, have determined that it's because the mock-up is actually the thing in the way more than the notes I've written themselves. But I just wanted to point out really quickly that some people, their mock-up is kind of this gesture, and then they sort of finish the writing in the orchestration phase. I've never understood that, but that is a valid way to work. But I just wanted to highlight that it is all verbatim there. I try to make the mock-ups, even if you can't hear the parts very clearly articulated, every single note is there. So here's the mock-up again. Almost impossible to hear that in the mock-up, but when you compare it to the final, where'd it go? You can really hear violas and cellos quite nice, and it adds a really nice internal dialogue separate from the central big loud violin tune. Man, these little like that little just I like to keep the pot always moving. It's just one of my little personal tendencies, but it's one that I always am banging my head against the wall with regard to mock-ups because it's just so much work to make that stuff come out. But you can see that those parts are all there. Where'd my piano roll go? Like, it's not that this is the easiest indication of that, but you can still see nonetheless. Everything's there. I guess it's also clear that I tend to get a little dense with my harmonies, and that's perhaps a failing. Any questions so far about this stuff? Because I want to shift gears to a far more produced thing. That's got a lot of layers going on that I think might be of interest, especially given that a few of the conversations already with you guys have kind of tapped into that notion of, and I think it's quite common. I come from a sort of traditional classical background, and the manipulation of sound is a little more alien to me. And I wanted to showcase some work of mine that's current that goes there. But are there any questions about this stuff? I recognize, by the way, that This doesn't at all talk about the complexity of the implementation of Erica, which is kind of its big thing. This is just the theme, which is essentially the only cue in the whole score other than the ending credits, I think, that just plays start to finish like a traditional cue. But are there any questions from anybody? I have the chat open, but also just if anybody wants to unmute and chime in, now is an excellent opportunity to.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I'm the only person that raised my hand, but
Go for it.
yeah, now that you've kind of set that up, I am kind of dying to, just see or hear about something that was kind of implemented for this game in particular, given its kind of like cinematic aspects that was implemented in a kind of more, indeterminate, nonlinear way.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me find a good. There's so many cues to choose from. Let me just make sure I'm choosing wisely here. Okay, yeah, I'm going to do this one. Forgive me for stopping the screen share for just one moment.
And also on that note, of choosing wisely or wisely, I just was wondering, like, do you actually, are you involved in implementation at all? Like, do you do anything like that, or
absolutely?
Is that yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Most games I work on, I'm not set up to literally do the scripting in Wise or Fmod myself. If only because they are an on-site audio director, music supervisor, audio technician of some kind, and I literally don't have the ability to push updates to the network that's constructing the builds or compiling everybody's individual contributions. I'm usually just not set up for that on a given project. There's usually also someone on the team, like it's almost always the case on the projects that I've been working on the last many years, that whoever's handling the sound design has been tasked with implementation before I'm even hired. And so I'm kind of paired with that person right out of the gate to say, here's sort of your brother or sister in arms, as it were, to get all this into the game. So, and the result of which is that my ability, my sort of Wise script writing skills have atrophied tremendously in terms of just navigating the interface itself over the years, because I've just been partnered with people on every project for like 12 years running now. But that said, I always get in there with them. And first off, the music is always written very much for how it will be implemented. I don't ever write linear music and then find some way to reverse engineer it into being adaptive. I find that to be a very, very bad way to approach it, because you are trying to delinearize something that was conceived of linearly. And my suggestion is try to think of it from the start non-linearly, which is a giant fucking challenge, because it basically says, hey, you know that thing that you know about music that has been true of music for the entirety of human history? You get to play with that variable now. And so for me, the linearity of music being a parameter, no different than rhythm, harmony, texture, color, range, is fascinating, and the reason why I love video games so very much. It gives us this new part of our tool chest that just did not exist ever in history prior to this. But of course, you have to really adapt to it, because it's not a trivial shift. It really is. The more you think of it this way, like, I'm not a fan of just saying, well, let's just stem out the music and like just find ways to kind of remix the stems into various states, where it's like, yeah, that's still very much a linear piece, though, that you're just kind of approaching like a DJ, which is a totally valid art form, but that's not really non-linear composition, at least as far as it could go, potentially. So now, that said, there are always limiting factors that you have to contend with. The game is not, if on one hand you have completely linear music, and on the other extreme you have like purely procedurally generated music that has no linear constraints whatsoever and can be completely algorithmically, AI powered, composed in real time and produced in real time. As if those represent sort of poles on a continuum, or outer edges of a continuum, often the design of the game itself will tell you where you're going to end up more than anything, and not just because of technical constraints, but also because of the experience of playing the game. This is a big part of why I think being a gamer is so, I say very cautiously, necessary to score games, because in the end, it's not truly necessary. But I can't fathom how I would have written most every score that I've written if I didn't understand the game systems through the lens of being a player. One of my favorite examples for that I don't have prepared to go into here would be on Assassin's Creed Syndicate, where I had played all the prior Assassin's Creed games before, or most of them, before stepping into that game. So I knew the systems very well, and I had thoughts about, here's what's always bugged me about the music implementation that I would love to explore trying to fix, and here, or not fix, but improve on, iterate on. And here are things that I think work great that I would love to keep doing the way you guys have been doing. Or here are systems I don't think we need at all, or here are whole new systems that we've never even thought of, and all those kinds of things. And they were amazing to work with, because we got to really kind of rebuild their whole approach to music in many respects on that game, but because it was built around the player experience, which I knew very well. I just, as a fan of that franchise. So in the case of Erica, the thing that's so interesting is that it's not the fact that I'm a gamer that arms me. It's the fact that I watch a lot of movies, because Erica is aspiring to be so film-like, but yet very interactive as a game. And if you're comparing it to like the Black Mirror episode Bandersnatch, that was basically a film that had some sort of novel token interactivity to it, whereas Erica is conceived pretty thoroughly as a game. And there's more mechanics than just click on that door to make Erica walk through that door. Even their dialogue system was pretty nuanced. But the big revelation was, in a lot of games, we get very lazy. It's like, okay, here's a dialogue scene, so there's just a loop that's like our dialogue cue. And I said, you think you could ever get away with that scoring a film? When you score a film and you're underscoring dialogue, it's like if I say to you, how you doing? And the reply from the other character is to say, cut the shit, I know where the body's buried. I guarantee you, as a composer, you're going to score the shift in tone that has suddenly occurred unexpectedly in this scene. Well, if it's, I'm sorry, we just need 20 minutes of looping dialogue music in a game, well, you've just missed a massive opportunity for storytelling. Of course, some games, especially really dialogue-driven, like large-scale RPGs and stuff, basically give you this exponential sort of fractal problem as a result, where the only way to solve this is to have 47,000 hours of music in the game. And so I recognize that this is not something that I think we've found the be-all, end-all solution to just as an industry, because it's consistently a problem. The scope of games can be so huge. Now, one of the ways that games have solved this, which I'm not a fan of, is by writing incredibly dynamically flat, unnuanced, uninteresting dialogue, where a generic, boring loop is perfectly fine because it's identical to the caliber of the writing of the dialogue. But if you play games like The Last of Us or Telltale's Walking Dead games, or any number of like David Gaider's games, like the Dragon Age series, there's some serious work being done in the industry to try to say, well, no, that's not enough. We want to make characters talk like real people, and we want to give them nuanced conversations where if I say X and then this person comes very unexpectedly with Y, let's make that real and emotional and powerful. Well, in the case of Erica, because you're watching real human actors, there was just no getting around it. Especially because they would lean on that, whereas a lot of games wouldn't necessarily have the caliber of like motion capture or facial capture available to make, an expression on someone's face the way they reply to that dialogue. A lot of games, it's just, if it's not the words, because it's an outgrowth of text adventures, basically, you just have to say everything through words. Well, a game like Erica, you can shoot it like a movie, which means if I say something really provocative, maybe somebody just gives me a look like they don't even know what to say now in response. Well, I got to score all that crap. It can be very, very difficult. So the way that I tended to do it, let me go back into screen share. And this may end up taking the rest of my time, but I think that that's potentially worth it. Did we ever think of a potential solution to the DP audio challenge 2020? I'm on this screen for you guys, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so if I zoom in here, you can see that I've got this scene where this is a scene where I chose a very simple one intentionally. This is a scene where, and you'll see I've got all kinds of notes in DP here. This is a scene where Erica is being hit. The whole premise of the story, I should back up, is that she's this orphan who doesn't have, she's these traumatic childhood memories about having found the murdered body of her father. You saw little glimpses of that in the video I played. It's a really amazing, uplifting, kind of beautiful and serene gaming experience, as you can imagine. It's like a David Lynch kind of feel-good story. And so I'm hearing noises. I think that was Discord. Somewhere in the background. Ignore that. The ironic thing is I can't possibly open that or I will reveal all manner of NDA violating things. So just bear with me. The scene that I've chosen here is where she agrees to go under a form of hypnosis to try to learn something about her past. And so the scene, you can see I've basically written out a series of simple cues here. Like here's one between bar 11 and 16. This is the first cue, which I am calling XM19A, which is just the intro, which I guess I have to play. Well, just tell me, let's just pretend somehow I did something different with my setup. Tell me if this sounds terrible compared to just playing the files directly.
It sounds pretty small.
Yeah,
Is
it's
it
the
no
same issue
good?
from before. Yeah.
Yeah, so strange. Okay, well, the hell with it. So here we go. XM19. Now, first thing you'll notice, I had to make little notes to myself because linear DAWs there's no real good way to do this that I've found yet. But you'll notice here I have a note that L2 equals harp and Tina as a one shot. And so I have to do some real-time comboing here. Here's L2. These are the final mixes, obviously. Very high. The Tina effects is basically those sort of very distant harmonics. And then some harp with a little delay. So that is L2 means layer 2. That is the top layer of this little segment, and it only plays once. So if I were to combine these here in my super old-fashioned QuickTime Pro, then what you get is this. Very subtle and understated. Now, the L2 is what I added to that. So then it loops just as this. And I chose the cue to be this length because I played through the scene 1,000 times and I determined that very few people are likely to hear this thing more than twice in a row. So you essentially just write a cue that has, it's of however long this is, not 12 seconds give or take with a little reverb tail, that has kind of an A section and a B section, where the B section is just the A section with a few less elements. But the ear, especially if you make something relatively distinctive for the part that you're removing, the ear doesn't really hear it as a repeat at all. It just hears it as, oh, now there's new stuff. But I've only written, what did we determine? I've only written 5-6 bars of music. And so that gets us through. Now, once the actual therapy session begins, you'll notice the first part here is XM19B, which goes in this session from 20 to 30. Also, because this is a film, I would actually make captures and I would score them to the picture if they had very specific timings that I know I needed to hit, like a movie. Like there are certain elements where we're going back and forth between looping or non-looping parts. And so for the non-looping ones, those are basically just scoring a scene, right? You're just scoring traditional footage. And so I would park those wherever they were within the QuickTime. So you'll notice this has 11 bars of emptiness. That's not anything clever. That's just because in the QuickTime I would happen to be using, this was where this part started, which is the ending of the scene, which is a non-linear bit. So the part before it is the loop. So it's actually quite clear, I think, if you look, that this part loops just more than one time before we get to the ending. If you kind of visualize, the idea of it being like this, right? It's pretty simple. But notice I've actually also split it into 3 layers deep. In case it's a lot longer than that, there's a lot that we can do with this layer. So layer 1 of XM19B is this. Our Tina effects. So again, this is why just mindless use of stems won't work. The Tina effects stem has now migrated into the base loop, which is, I always use L1 as, if anything is looping, for my own memory's sake, I always use L1 unless context calls otherwise. But you notice that part is now repeating. And the harp and the little kind of piano-y sounds. It's pretty unintrusive. Part 2, you'll notice, adds violin. And you'll notice I made a little note, a little reminder to myself. I said, violin, subtle ghost trills. There's no attempt to even mock that up. I just double-tracked the violinist while she was recording. I said, can you give me some trills where you're just barely hitting the second note of the trill? And I'll layer that in with the primary sort of melody. It's like an echo of the notes that she's playing. I thought, I don't even know how to mock that up. I don't even want to try. Just make a note to myself to remember to add that while we're recording, even if it's 6 months later. So I make these little markers, and it's one of those that most likely they won't even notice those kind of changes on the developer side, or they'll just say, hey, it sounds better, I guess because it's live. And like, well, it's live and there's more stuff. There's more material happening. And then, so that you'll notice we're doing that as a one-shot, non-looping bit. The violin, it's the most prominently melodic thing. So here's the beginning, and here's the idea. She's starting off this therapy session where they're saying, they're projecting images on a wall and saying, tell us how it makes you feel. And then you choose what to click on. In fact, I can show you the scene from my rough capture that I made myself. Hopefully it's not too dark. It looks super dark on here, but okay, yeah. So so they show a shot of flowers. We have nature, beauty, perfume, or growth as what we're able to respond with. The character chose and then very quickly, and they start going faster and faster and faster. And so the scene, at some point, like you can even say, notice that one of the options is wait, but they also start moving faster than you can. And at some point they move faster that it will just happen without you. And the player doesn't realize we've shifted into a non-interactive moment for a few seconds. And so I make that the moment that we shift to the final section of the cue. But I have to build, right? So we start off innocuous. Oh, it's beauty, it's growth. So, we've got this nice little thing here. Very simple. Well, the violin doesn't repeat. So, it goes away and this is what's left. But then, of course, you saw things start to tilt a little darker, a little darker. So then we add in L3. You'll see this, that's the universal symbol for aleatoric MIDI. You can just spot it a million miles away. So here's my Nashville Bass Ensemble. And you'll notice, for the sake of the mock-up, I did it 3 times on 3 different articulations, like a legato patch, a chamber sustain patch, and then also a tremolo, just so that the mock-up, what I just played was the live, but just since we're looking under the hood here, you can see I did make some aspiration for the mock-up to sound semi-passable there. But so notice that changes the tone of the scene quite a bit. So now L1 plus L3 only, because we're further into the scene and things are starting to get dark. And the thing that I don't specify on here is that they're looping all together where L3 is muted, which means that once we pass a certain point, we add L3 to the mix. We don't wait till it to circle back to the beginning of the loop. And when it's an aleatoric gesture like that, and you're not interrupting the middle of a melody, you can get away with that very easily. Like if it had been muted, you're just hearing this, and then this kind of gets added. So all I've done is I've added just this slight gradation away from things are not going so well for dear Erica, and then like I said, at XM19C. We shift into this brief little ending of the scene where it starts to become a linear moment, even though the player at first doesn't realize it. Of course, is what I used as the beginning of my little video I showed you. So you can feel the really big shift that happened about halfway through that. And the reason why, spoiler, I'll show you. So what I also did on this project that I don't normally do, but it was very useful. I would do video capture, and then if you go down here, you see here's all my printed stems, and like here's my vocalist Sayonga, here's Caroline violin, or sorry, that's the saxophone, that violin that's here, basic mix, and then here I actually create a mock edit simulating exactly what Wise will be doing. So you can see here's the loop, we crossfade into this at this point, and then I make a bunch of different captures and I move the stems around to showcase here's how it should look, because in this case I was working, the guy implementing everything in Wise was in London, and so he was on such a different time zone that I would create 2 or 3 versions of the scene based on how quickly the player was choosing things and whatnot, and send him quick times of all of them so that he could hear how the music is supposed to sound under a variety, because I could make all the transitions and everything really nice and smooth, et cetera, et cetera. And then here is... Oh, I forgot one other thing, by the way. XM19D, you'll see this little 3-bar, that actually happens before C. Because what it is a little stinger for when the mask shows up. I clicked the wrong file, but you'll hear it in the context of this video. still also in the previous queue. We haven't gotten rid of XM19. But then we shift and we populate the Obviously, this is an unfinished visual effect. And then you'll notice we transition back into a loop because the player actually has to interact with this scene before we can. And and there's like janky, broken, bad versions of other scenes that appeared, but it gives you a sense of it. Like this game, the rule with the director was we can't ever go more than 15 seconds without the player having some kind of meaningful interaction, which meant that the score is like, you create this thing that then shatters into a million pieces and has to be able to reassemble like the T-1000. I mean, because look at this. This basically up to this point is not even 2 minutes. And there's probably some pre-roll before the scene actually begins at the start. Yeah, I don't think the queue even starts officially till about there. So, we're talking about everything I've just said for the last like 25 minutes, 30 minutes was to get us through barely a minute and a half of the game. And this is a pretty straightforward scene because you can't leave the scene. You're not talking to someone and reacting to them. And so it was crazy. I mean, the final score, you notice that this queue is this quote queue is XM19A, which has 2 layers, XM19B, which has 3 layers, XM19C, which is just a 1 layer straightforward thing, XM19D, and then there's an outro of XM19E, and then depending on what happens, there's also a little ending tag where there's no music in between them of XM19F. So it's all just, XM19 because we don't, I use the movie sort of numbering scheme, except there's not reals. So instead of like 1M1, 2M1 or whatever, I just call it XM blank. I don't know if that's standard or not. It's just something I've always done, but to give you a sense. And so here we are, there's 5 or 6 queues with multiple layers deep within them just to get us through this tiny little bit. So the whole final total of the score is something like 300 plus queues or something like that, just to get us through a single 90-minute playthrough of the game. I mean, it's crazy how it almost killed me. There were definitely some days where I was like, I don't know if I should have said yes to this job, because it was just kicking the crap out of me, because there were so many times where I'd break a scene apart, because it was up to me to determine all of this. It's not like they dictated to me, okay, start with a loop and it should have multiple layers. I would play the game and I would say, okay, well, clearly this is where it starts to turn a little dark or a little weird, and I think that the music should shift here. And I would pitch to them this implementation scheme, and then they would go, okay, cool, let's try it, let's implement it. And more often than not, what happened is the director would go, but there's a shot that we're kind of ignoring. And it's like, okay, well, let's just add another cue. And so it's like, there were so many times where the notes were not really about the music. They were just about making it even more granular and even more sort of bespoke, which was, it was like as the deadlines were looming. I can't fathom how I'd be feeling right now with all of that if I was having to do all that in the context of like social isolation and not being able to do recording sessions. Probably, I just have a nervous breakdown because this game was so freaking hard as it was. So I feel very lucky that it worked out this way. Anyway, so that's a semi deep dive into just this one. I didn't even touch, all the kind of production-y things that I'm doing on some of this stuff. Some of it happened here, and then some of it, what you'll see here below. What I'm hiding, just so for those curious how I do my mock-ups, is all of these different MIDI channels are routing through different contact instances that are on another computer, And then coming back, so I've got my folder of Vienna Pro returns and all the different places that these are routing to. This is just kind of like my giant bus folder. And then some of those are getting sent to various reverbs. And then it all eventually funnels its way to these stems up here. And then those funnel their way eventually through just a very simple little ozone mastering just for purposes of mockups, and then to here. And then what I do is I export all of this to my mixer, who mixes everything in Pro Tools. And some of these things I'm sending with my effects. Some of them I'm sending pretty dry. And obviously any mocked up elements that have subsequently been recorded are coming in from whatever Pro Tools session they were recorded in, and we blend it all together. But then because I don't want to sit here and re-import all my MIDI data and shit into Pro Tools, and also just because I'm faster and more comfortable in DP, to be honest, we re-export out of Pro Tools all of the mix stems, and then I cut them. So these are the stems out of my mixer's Pro Tools session. I pull them back into DP, and I cut them to match precisely the mockup, so that all I have to do is just re-deliver audio files exactly like I delivered the mockup. And it's a 2-second operation to swap out the final recordings for the mockups the other way around, I guess, swipe out the mockups for the final recordings as part of the final delivery of the game. And this lets me just kind of error proof, because if I pull in a file and, you can see I make these markers where if I'm pulling in a mix stem and I can see all the audio, I can just spot check it. This is where it starts. This is where it ends. Ignore my little marker in the middle. If I pull in my stems and things are for some reason trailing past, I can tell I've already screwed something up before I even hit play. And so it's just and because a score of this level of complexity is constantly about guarding against human error, pilot error, that kind of thing, I'm always looking for opportunities to catch myself in a mistake. Because it's just so easy with so many. I'm very anal about file management. I'm able to find things very quickly and easily, and very, very consistent naming schemes with my file names and all that sort of stuff. But this is one of those ways that just at a glance, I can tell if it's right or if it's wrong. And that helps enormously. I see the chat here blinking here. Question for Austin: when he's available? Well, I'm not doing anything. When you're starting on a project, what is the first thing that you do? What is the first thing that you write, and why? So a question from Hans. We'll just let our imagination wonder which Hans. It really depends. Often the first thing I do is I ask the developer, is there something specific that you're looking for first? And it is very common that the first thing they say is, we'd love to start with a theme or several themes, or let's explore. Or sometimes they'll say, look, we're not even sure what we want in terms of themes, but let's use the discussion of theme to find a palette. Like, do we want this to be orchestral? Do we want this to be, just all percussion? Or do we want a very electronic sound? Or do we want it to feel like EDM? Or should it blah, 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 blah. And so it's just very often about kind of setting the template, whether that's thematically, harmonically, or the literal sounds themselves. So in the case of Erica, for like a good year and a half, I worked on the game for something like 3 years. And for the first half of that, that's all we were doing. I wrote theme after theme after theme after theme to figure out what the actual sort of theme ought to be. And funny enough, the theme that we ended up with, that was not the last one that I wrote. It was like the second or third to last one. And then I did several past it. And I remember Jack, the director, was like, there's this one that you did a couple ago that I keep thinking about. And I feel like that's it. But it wasn't this slam dunk, that's the theme the first time they heard it. It was like, I like it more than the rest, I think. But I went through, I can't even tell you how many I wrote. It's just endless. Of kind of similar atmosphere. We knew the vibe, but we just didn't know the precise notes or didn't know the precise color. I originally, as you saw, I originally was planning this thing where I was going to record all these bass flutes and contrabassoons, and I had this whole scheme and I worked it out. And I remember the first time he heard that, he goes, "This feels like Tomb Raider." And I don't know why. There's nothing in Tomb Raider that sounds like that, but just the presence of low flutes made him think of it. Kind of his ear connected the dot of bass flute to, I guess, sort of like Native American flutes or bansuri or something, and he kind of did some mental math and found his way to Tomb Raider on his own and was like, "That's what this is now." And so I was like, okay, well, and subsequently almost all winds disappeared from the score after I fought tooth and nail. It was like, okay, 2 flutes, 1 flute, okay, clarinet, oboe. I tried a lot of things because I just love winds. And we ended up at a very, very string heavy score. So it's like, okay, well, when in doubt, Tina. And of course, instantly it gets approved. And but there's no, I mean, I get it. It's just, she's anything's been proved with her added to it. But yeah, so in any case, that is very often how I start. Sometimes though, it's like, I'm just going to pick a random part of the game and just use that to kind of explore some ideas. Or sometimes they say, look, actually here, I can play you an example. I'm currently working on this game, The Pathless. And so at the very beginning, I decided to do a little recording. They basically said, Matt and I had done a game together called Abzu, and we had also worked together on Journey. So we have this, long history and good friends. He was working with a different publisher, and he basically, it was one of those, like, it would be really good if you wrote a piece of music to kind of explore some of the ideas that we're going for. And it wasn't really presented as you have to demo to get this job per se, but it was kind of like, wink, wink, the publisher would really like to hear something. And I thought, okay, well, I should just be very direct about my approach to this. And so I decided to write a theme, and then I put together a session and just recorded it. But what that let us do is explore. We were able to discuss, where all is this score going to have to go, because I'm going to treat this theme as not really a theme, but more like an overture, and go various places within a single piece that will have almost no practical application in the final game, but lets us kind of explore some sounds that we like. So this is what I wrote. I knew that I wanted to feature throat singers. There's a strong Mongolian influence on a lot of the art direction and things, but I also wanted it to be this kind of global jam band. So there's a lot of soloists from various cultural sort of folk traditions throughout the score, the front and center of which is the Norwegian. This is why I was getting messed up earlier, mixing the Swedish and the Norwegian. The Swedish instrument of the Nyckelharpa versus the Norwegian instrument of the Hardanger fiddle. This score features the Swedish Nyckelharpa as one of its central solos, which you hear right out of the gate, and then some orchestra, some throat singing, and then you'll hear there's some big kind of boss battle chases and stuff in this score that you don't need to represent those in a theme, but here is how it sounds in that initial presentation that I did. Some very quiet, sort of tense but understated moments. the interest of time. So you'll hear the, sort of how I was like, I want action, nickel harpa. It's like this little busybody of soloists. It's not really an orchestral score. The idea is I want a bunch of these. It's like this village people of soloists where everybody's kind of got their own thing going on. Very dated reference. You get the idea. This was just a way to say, like, how do those colors sound in this context, even though it's going to be a year and a half before I write any of those cues. And then, so that it's kind of a long-winded, answer to the question of sort of how do we start, but that is very often one of the things we do is just say, where does this need to go? Where is this material going to eventually have to be able to take us? And the thing is, in this case, it's been almost 3 years now that I've been working on this game, and the final score is actually quite different from this. We've iterated so much that some of these cues, especially the big sort of chases and stuff, they're really, really different from what I just played. And in fact, I can play you a little bit, which no one has heard ever. This is not like this is public. So here I will move these files out of the way, but you can hear the like what I mean by the sort of the cadre of solos. Sort of bizarre folk music, and then that hands off to like there's all these transitions that I'm skipping because it's obviously it's interactive, but the idea is to only feature something orchestral in very select places. So here's where it becomes briefly, it's just strings with all those other, like the oud is kind of the primary instrument here. hear the little my wonderful Tuvan ensemble, the Alash ensemble, and then I'll give you one last little taste of a thing. Matt actually said, "What if we had horns?" Like, and I said, "You mean French horns?" He goes, "Yeah, it's not really an orchestra, but just horns." And he said, "And what if they were like hunting horns?" And I said, "Well, interestingly, that is kind of the earliest origins of the modern French horn, and we think of as this beautiful regal, you know." That ain't its origins. So I said, what if we do some super crazy aggressive horn parts? So we did this just absolutely ridiculous session with 10 horns at Abbey Road for this. We had 5 horns on the right side of the room and 5 on the left, and it was all written as mostly this call and response, where they're dropped right into the mix exactly how they are sitting in the game. And some of it is just was so hard. I was like, yeah, we'll do these like sort of medieval hunting horns, as though they also understood octatonic scales back then. So good times. That's sort of like the most gentle version. That's sort of like the earliest version of that stuff that you hear in the game. But I'm keeping this very NDA friendly, even though it's a relatively transparent production on this game. But that gives you a sense, like, that first piece that I played you is pretty markedly different from this, and there were about 1,000 steps in between before we arrived at this sort of. It's like tribal with no actual ethnicity kind of vibe. It's not from anywhere. It's sort of globally, kind of in a way, from everywhere. I see a couple other questions in the chat here. I just also realized the time, so I think I need to pivot at some point here back to my one-on-one. So I'm relying on my administrative overlords to point me in the right direction. But in the meantime,
hello, I'm here. Hi. How are you?
This is fun. I'm just talking at my screen.
And like, I'm getting so much feedback on my phone right now of people texting me and telling me how much they're enjoying this. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. I thought you were saying you're getting all these texts from people that are saying like they're out of hand sanitizer. So it's just utterly unrelated.
No. They forgot about that for a minute because they're enjoying your lecture so much.
Oh, well, I'm glad I reminded everyone and just brought it right back down. Well, cool. If you want, I'm basically at your service. I don't want to screw anybody out of one-on-ones who were banking on it. It's also very easy for me to just keep answering questions. And
why don't you answer these questions, and then at 3:30 we will go to Jessica, and Jessica will go for 45 minutes, and then we'll go to Garrett for 45 minutes.
Okay, and then
that sounds good.
We're also missing. I don't have the list in front of me, but I remember we flipped around some names, didn't we? Because I think there's a third name that's that should be on that list if I recall?
Joshua, but he didn't turn in his score, so he is not ready to go. He's not ready for prime time.
No, it's all good. I'm happy to just make myself useful here. So, okay, cool. My screen share is not enabled, right?
Actually, it is. We can see your desktop.
Oh boy,
Beautiful desktop.
messy desktop. Where did this life-saving this thing here? Aha!
That desktop is the story of my life, by the way.
I know.
Yep.
Thing
Looks
is, I
all
just
right.
don't know what's intermingled in there. Old stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes. Stop share. Let's do
It's a
that.
combination of things you don't want us to see and things that we probably shouldn't see.
Well, there's no like corpses, but I just mostly I'm very, very organized about projects. But sometimes if someone sends me a thing, hey, check this out, I just drop it on there. But
Yeah.
the thing is, sometimes people send me things that I also aren't they're not supposed to send me, and I'm actually looking at it again now to make sure. I think it's fine. It's mostly just old shit. That's, like doesn't matter. In any case, do you make piano sketches? Generally, no. I am writing a musical right now, though, and I am forcing myself to do piano sketches on that because it is an entirely different process, and I really love making it as sort of raw and organic as possible. I've only ever really dabbled with that a couple of times in the past. The one time I've ever worked for another composer was I orchestrated a good chunk of a score Alan Menken wrote for a very terrible movie called Mirror Mirror. And it was this bad Julia Roberts Snow White iteration that it's strange because the director of that movie is pretty brilliant, Tarsem Singh, but I don't know why that movie, I was not a fan. But Alan Menken wrote a very Alan Menken score, which meant it was very memorable and melodic and catchy and sort of bright and shiny colored. And my agent called me and said, look, I know that you're not exactly on the hunt for orchestration jobs, but his normal orchestrator is really tied up on something and needs people that can handle themselves in the kind of old school place of the classic use of the orchestra, the very traditional Disney sort of aesthetic, and we know that that's probably in your wheelhouse. Would you be interested in doing this? And I was like, oh hell yes. I'm not looking for orchestration jobs because this was I think 9 years ago. And in fact, I remember now that I jog my memory, I was doing that while producing all the final recording sessions for Journey. We were about 3 months out from Journey coming out. And I was having to do double duty on orchestrating an Alan Menken score and orchestrating my own Journey stuff. And it was not an easy few months there, but he literally does everything at the piano. I would get MIDI files of piano performances of him playing. And it would be like, he has all his little tricks, where he has a pretty good sense of what he wants it to be, but he also, lets the orchestrator be an orchestrator. So if the melody, comes in, if it's one of these that's pianistically played as, or some other very plausibly Menken sounding bit, this like, you're not going to orchestrate that verbatim that way, right? You're going to have like bass pits go and then cello double stop maybe on, or something like that. Violas, or some, maybe that's a little too busy for it, but something along those lines. And then maybe an oboe solo or whatever. And then send him the mock-up. And if he approves the mock-up, he might have notes. Send it. Then that goes to the director. Your mock-up goes to the director as the mock-up that he then gives Alan feedback based on, and which was horribly intimidating. But because it was like, if this cue gets rejected, that's like they're rejecting an Alan Menken cue. But isn't that kind of my fault? It was crazy experience. It's the only time I've ever worked with the piano to orchestration process so purely like that. I can play you one other example, actually. Hold on, though. I think I have to turn screen sharing back on just to ensure that the audio is being captured. This is from a project long ago that it never made the light of day. For anyone who's unfamiliar, I released an album last summer called Remnants, which is piles and piles of unused material from mostly rejected demos. There are some cues on there that are from scores of projects that were canceled before they came out. And there's also music on there for projects that they just sort of unexpectedly fired me. And so I was left with music that had no home. But the vast majority of this album, and it's a big album, it's solidly 90 minutes of music, and it's less than half of what it could have been. I trimmed a ton. I've just written a lot of demos. That music, one of the very last one, if I remember, was a thing that I did where I wanted to write a song, and let me see here. Let me just change some file names here before they appear on the screen. I wanted to write a song, and so I did this one as a piano. No one's ever heard this, and I'll probably never share this ever again because in the album is only the final mix. So here was what I wrote. So it's like, it's the idea was, we're writing a song here, but I have no clue yet what the sort of instrumentation of it will be. And so I work with this amazing group of guys in Australia called Tripod that are just these brilliant songwriters and lyricists. And so I sent it to them and I said, here is a very vague description of what I think this ought to be about, but just have at it and just sort of, hopefully this melody is interesting to you. And so they always make little adjustments and tweaks and stuff. Sometimes they pretty heavily rewrite the melody, and when they do, it's almost always the better for it. But in this case, they then just sent me back a recording of themselves singing. Here's their lyric demo, as they called it.
The black horizon born anew. Tonight again her shadows grew, coming nearer. Her claw flashing jagged in the sky, and we hope for morning.
Gives you a sense. So then it was like, and then of course, as I always do, I instantly fell in love with their lyrics and just think that they're geniuses. And so I then was like, okay, well, how should this sound in the end? And then the final draft that I went through was sounded like this.
The black horizon born anew. Tonight again her shadows brew, coming nearer. Her claw flashing jagged in the sky, and we hold for morning.
So that is an example, very atypically, where it absolutely did start as a piano demo, and then we went from there because it made sense to get the tune right and get the lyrics right before we let ourselves get all caught up in the production of it. But sometimes those elements are inseparable from one another. All right, I don't want to neglect Jessica, so here is the last question here. Something the Van Timothy says, when you find you're working on those sketches to try to find the theme, Derek, what is the instrumentation, the mock-ups you sent to the developer? So I guess that is definitely related to this question. There were a few times actually where I did just send them a piano. It's like I would do these elaborate mock-ups and then be told, that theme doesn't really work. So then the next mock-up is a little less elaborate, and then it's just like, okay, do you like this tune? Or whatever, and I just would play it on piano and send it. So it gradually degraded as I got more desperate to find the right thing. Although I think I can find my I think I can find the actual file that had the theme like as okay. I think, let's see if it's this. Maybe you can see there's just like, how sometimes the joke is always the file extension is version final 2.0 final 3 actual final. I definitely got into that territory, which is unusual for me because this one is new themes Erica 2 version 4, whatever the fuck that means. Yeah, this was my pitch. This was the first time I presented them that melody, and it was where I did actually orchestrate. And it gets really huge. Exactly the same, but then I wrote one right after that was different. Erica 3 version 5 apparently. They were smart to go, no. And everything always seems like the best melody ever when you write it, and then you listen to it the next day and you go, I can't believe I had the courage to play that for somebody. But there are definitely some in here. I don't know why I don't see them in this folder, but there were definitely some where I just sent them the piano. But certainly the moment you leave the realm of the theme, and I only did that because I just was going through so many themes. But normally I would never do that because you're asking them to make a leap of faith in their imagination that they are not trained to do, in the same way that it's like if an actor were to go, okay, well, the line is help me, Obi-Wan, but just like imagine it good. Like if you were like, well, just do it good. Like if you're like auditioning an actor or something, don't just give me some horrible half-ass thing and expect me to fill in the gap, especially as a non-actor. And the same thing goes for visual effects people or cinematographers or any other, obviously any number of jobs within the game industry. You're asking a lot. The less that you can ask of them, the better. And so I always orchestrate things as precisely as possible. And the caliber of my mock-ups, as I mentioned before, tends to decline rather precipitously as we get farther into the project and build up some cachet and some trust and comfort with each other and that sort of thing. Like I mentioned on Assassin's Creed, my mock-ups were just atrocious. And so I did a recording up front because I said, there's just no way that I'm going to be able to do this much writing this early. I'm sorry, at this constant turnaround, and invest all this time in making the mock-ups sound really good, because we've carved out a sound that just does not lend itself to good mock-ups at all. But in any case, with that said, shall we pivot to Jessica, who I've had the pleasure of interacting with many times, it seems like, in the context of this SFCM ecosystem. Feels like my sense of time is so shot. It's like I visit once and it feels like it was 20 years ago, and it's like, oh, I've known each other forever. What do you have? Where would you like to go with this?
Yeah, hey. So I saw that you opened up my string quartet, but since we're in the video game realm right now, I thought we could look at my video game, the Sony video game thing that everyone else has been showing today.
Okay, sure.
So it's the Sony S2020, that folder.
Interesting. I have. Oh, I see. So your 2mix. I was looking at file names. Okay, cool. And obviously, just for sake of due diligence, and also just so I'm not relying on my memory, what is your? Remind me where you're coming from. Just as a composer, all that kind of thing, professionally. Like, what are you attacking here, and therefore, what do you feel like you're missing? Help direct me to be maximally useful to you. The same thing I keep asking everybody else.
Wait, let me think how to answer that. Wait, could you repeat that? Sorry.
Well, I just want to kind of know a little bit of your background, or in this case,
sure.
It would be a little bit of a refresher on your background, just to know where you're coming from, so I can I could hear it through that lens and more quickly get to what might be useful.
Yeah, okay. So I have a very classical background, been playing piano for years. And so my first time using a DAW was when I joined TAC 4 years ago.
Recurring theme here amongst you guys today.
Yeah. Like. So this project here, it's, we have the Sony project every semester. So this is my 8th one. So I would say I'm fairly familiar with a DAW now
at this point.
So, so I guess I guess I'd like you to just take a look at this and just, see what feedback you have.
Is this so? A few questions off out of the gate here. Is that within the realm of a 3 to 5 note theme? Is that the bones of it?
Yeah, I actually always break that rule, but no one says anything, so I just roll with it.
So you're 8 for 8 on your faculty not paying attention to how well you satisfy the constraints of the assignment. Good.
Sounds about right.
I thought it was interesting because I was like, I seem to recall earlier today hearing as a certain note,
I actually noticed that this morning. I was a little, it's okay.
it actually stems from the same conversation earlier with the melody that was like when things are derived from very familiar intervals, it's not surprising that we might find ourselves landing in similar patterns to our colleagues and or predecessors. That's in no way intended as a criticism. It's just made me laugh that at a glance, I was like, on paper, you might even assume they were from the same project. But the execution will be
great minds think alike. So
yeah, well, there you go. Exactly. So another 2 questions from me. Same as on Shawnee's, your flute part is not part of the scope of the recording. So what is the explanation there? Will this?
Yeah. So I decided to include the flute there because the ensemble that we are required to write for doesn't include the flute, but I am intending to get the flute live recorded by Mary Claire, actually. So, Mary Claire, I apologize for getting this done so late.
It's okay. I'm about to buy a whole bunch of really awesome pedals, so we'll make it awesome.
Okay, good to know. So I will be hearing a mock-up, but the flute and the rest of the ensemble on the score will all be recorded live, presumably. And then but there'll also be, I assume, a bunch of electronics or something along those lines in there too. Cool. And then my other question that I've been kind of asking everybody is just kind of a general overview of what your plan is. Is this semester your last semester?
It is, unfortunately.
And so then what is kind of, I know nobody knows, especially right now, kind of anything about anything. No, I feel like I've never left this room. But what is the hypothetical next step for you, just so that I can keep that in the back of my mind if it helps focus my feedback?
Well, it's either I go to grad school for composition or I just magically find a job, which would be ideal. So
So just straight in games specifically?
yeah, I would really like to write for games. Though film, I of course am also interested in writing for film.
Yeah, no, understood. All good. No wrong answer there. Just always curious to kind of contextualize this so that I'm not asking questions that I don't need to ask. All right, let's take a listen. You didn't tell your mock-up no vibrato. That out of the recording. Really nice. It's a great little tune. I'm venturing a guess that you're a fan of Gareth, because that feels very Ori to me, in a very non-derivative and a very attractive way, but it nonetheless gave me strong synesthetic visions of bright blue and white. Is that anything conscious, or is that are you going, what's Ori and what is a Gareth?
I know who and what you're referring to, but I have never listened to either game's score, so that's very flattering.
Yeah, well, it's right in the kind of like, those scores split the difference exactly as you've done here between the kind of modern Hollywood sensibility with like the big toms and stuff, and yet also a very kind of fairy tale, magical, classic fantasy vibe, especially obviously with this kind of Dorian, which I like. I it's funny how reading through that, even just before it came, I thought I would never have. I can't think of a single time I've ever descended down to the sharp 6 in a context like this. That's always somehow an upward destination, and I would have never somehow where I would have gone with that, I think. And so it was charming to me to feel caught off guard by such a simple twist, but it's a nice way to make it feel like, oh, that's a little different. I will say, as just one piece of random kind of esoteric feedback, is the guitar is kind of superfluous. And not that should necessarily, I'm not of the mind. I remember let me back up. There was a composer I went to school with who has done reasonably well in concert music. I don't think he's ever once touched anything outside of writing, large scale orchestral works and chamber works. But we did undergrad together at USC. And whenever we did our readings with the student orchestra, I would tend to write like you here. For example, it's funny how I feel like I was playing chess with you while reading through this, because I'm sitting here, and as we're getting to around, this area, bar 23, I'm like, sure is odd that the viola is just sort of left out of this. And it was occurring to me in this very sort of suspect way. And of course you sneak it in, but then what I love is you totally saw me coming, because then there's this great big viola exposed solo as this sort of like counterpoint, the yin and the yang, and that charmed me. It made me smile. And that's very much the kind of thing that I always love to do. I saw an orchestra as this aggregate of soloists or chamber group subsets of the whole. I rarely ever am that excited by big, full, thick tutti writing, because it's like basically an orchestra playing tutti just sounds like its loudest members. So you basically hear piccolo and trumpets and trombones and maybe percussion, and then the rest is just kind of like this wall of noise all coming together, unless it's really exceptionally orchestrated and recorded, which is the biggest challenge in those contexts. To me, a large, full sound tends to kind of sort of neutralize itself in terms of the interesting colors. It just, at least to my ear, I've always been more excited to hear all the different colors that lie within the whole. And you're doing that here. You're teasing them out in kind of nice ways, which is why it stood out to me that the guitar was virtually a non-entity. Now here's the thing. They told you have a guitar, but if you were just scoring a game and this was your theme, it's not like there's this checkbox you have to hit of I need to use the guitar. So don't take my note to mean, what are you doing? You're wasting a perfectly good guitar, because it didn't ever feel creatively like it was this missed opportunity. You did a really good job at working with the other elements very satisfyingly. But I just thought I would mention, other than this little gesture here, I kind of don't remember anything of the guitar after that, this little bar 11 bit. And that's okay. But just making you aware of that. I mean, but like as an example, I did the ASCAP film scoring workshop years and years ago, where they give you this big full orchestra at Fox to record your piece with, and they assign you a scene from like a major movie, and 3 or 4 people will score that scene, and then very often the original composer of that will come, or maybe someone from their team or whatever. And I remember I did a scene from this horse racing movie called Dreamers that John Debney had done the original score for, and we had the whole orchestra, including piano, and it was Mike Lang on piano, who's like a god of piano. I mean, he's one of the legendary musicians of LA, and he's not just a mere session musician. He's also a jazz pianist that could roll with the best of the best. I mean, you could put this guy in a room with, Bill Evans in some universe where that is possible. And there'd be there would be an interesting sort of jazz piano cage match as far as I'm concerned, because Mike he's just an absolute treasure and ludicrously gifted musician. And even knowing he was there, I just thought, I don't have a use for piano in the way I've conceived of this cue. So I remember he just literally tacit it. So I've got this world-renowned musician in 75-piece orchestra or whatever. And then the hilarious thing is he comes up to me after the session and he goes, I played on the original and it was all piano solos. So he was like, this was actually amusing because now I could watch the footage for once while the orchestra was reading it down, which I had no idea because I wasn't like you. I wasn't familiar at the time with the well, not like you because you're not actually doing an Ori thing. It just reminded me of that. But yeah, anyway, it was really funny that just had stepped right into the opposite. And but I don't consider that myself to have done something wrong that day by underutilizing the piano. I'm just pointing it out since it's something at your disposal, and obviously, getting a recording is always an exciting opportunity you want to make the most out of. It's just worth thinking about if you are scratching your head thinking, I wonder if there's more I can do with it. Even just at the end where you had the chords down here, even that, if you wanted to make a little bit more of a meal, or just during the recording, just tell them, instead of every 2 beats, flesh it out and do kind of a proper sort of like, play, strum their way kind of rhythmically through that in just a kind of ad hoc way, following your harmonies. I've certainly done that in sessions before, and it just becomes another layer, especially in this case, since you're not at risk of them sitting next to the flute part and bleeding into the flute mic, which is always something to bear in mind. It's part of the reason why I would almost never record guitar, even if you could put everybody in the same room together. It's one of those sounds that you always want treated differently. Almost always should be drier than everybody else, unless it's a special, at least to my taste. It's just, I always want it to be more present in the mix than everybody. It's probably just my personal taste. That said, I remember on Ratatouille, Giacchino, during all the big kind of showstopper numbers, like the scene in the training montage in the kitchen, there was all these like ukuleles and guitar and stuff playing along with the orchestra, and they were in the room with the orchestra at Sony. I mean, it was absolutely an ensemble thing, so it's not like there's a rule here. But yeah, I quite like it. Do go listen to Ori, and you'll laugh at how kind of it's not like his theme is very different from yours. Like his theme is very, in a way, I've always thought his theme sounded very like Studio Ghibli. It feels very anime, and to the extent that one can wrap that aesthetic orchestrally into a big package, which is unfair to do, especially because there's so much jazz in that world, and there's basically zero in Ori. But setting all those caveats aside, yours doesn't have that feel, but still your blend of that kind of magical fairy tale sound, at least to my ear, and the pretty modern production, especially with the percussion, is I think you'll laugh that you kind of tapped into it instinctively, but in a way that's flattering. There's nothing that I see about this that feels broken, where I think, oh, you're really, setting yourself up for a challenge. You even had the savvy to not even bother recording those short spiccato string bits, or at least I assume, since they're not on the score, but they were very present in your mix. What is that correct? Am I reading?
Yeah, I have like stem strings that will not be replaced, and then the stuff that's on the score, I'm intending to blend them with samples.
Yeah.
So it would just have a fuller sound instead of having like, 2 violins versus a whole section.
I mean, the way you've scored it, it looks like it's sweetening a string section, because that many sort of octaves and unisons and things like that are going to sound better with 25 or 30 or 40 strings. But if you add these thick harmonies, it would play really well, even just as solos nested within the larger, production of sampled other stuff. That's very much a viable sound, at least to my ear. I mean, that's basically exactly what I did on Assassin's Creed, and I think it sounded okay. I like the results reasonably. But in this case, yeah, you're doing kind of the classic sort of remote control approach of picking your battles and recording those sort of long melodic parts and doubling them with your samples, and then just don't even bother with all the short choppy stuff. That's classically how you look at composers like Ramin Djawadi and Henry Jackman, and that's their production trick they've been using for years. Of the samples are so thoroughly produced by this point that you're not going to beat that. So no shame in just using it. They do. So yeah, it's really nicely done. It was funny how the one other comment that I have is you have this one little decoration here. There's sort of that one novel moment, and it kind of made me raise an eyebrow because it was nice, but it also felt rather unprecedented within the vibe. And it made me wonder if there's not earlier areas where, when Mary Claire tracks this for you, if she can't ornament the flute part or do little things to kind of have a similar affect as what you've written out there, just because it felt a little left field for me at the end. Whereas, even just the very beginning, I mean, ironically, I love that it's with passion, now play non-vibrato half notes. It's a little hilarious to my sensibility, but I get what you mean. Although for what it's worth, your sample playing with vibrato, I thought maybe just check yourself if you really do want that senza on the day. But even just those little just little things that make it, because you do it later, it might be worth thinking about here. If the idea is to have it as bare bones and sort of unadorned as possible, then ignore what I am saying. But yeah, out of sheer curiosity, what makes the D flat like the magic note where she gets to vibrate and everywhere on either side of it is supposed to be non-vibrato? This is purely because I'm curious, because it's like isolating this one note with a different sensibility.
Yeah. Now that I'm looking at the score again, I'm also kind of questioning myself why I put non-vibrato on that section.
Well, what I invariably do is I say, let's try it multiple ways. And then also the musicians sometimes, especially with bowings, because I always put in bowings, and then they'll say, can I change this one thing, because the way you have that 12 bars later would be really satisfying as a down bow, but if I follow everything you've done, I'm going to be forced into an up bow, and you'll like it better if we do this. So what if I change bow here in the middle, like pretending this was a violin part? Maybe they would say, let's do these two together, and then a fresh, up bow on bar 6 kind of thing, because downstream I'm going to want to do this. And it amazes me how I've friends and colleagues sometimes who never have those conversations. They just say, just play what's on the page. And I always find that that's kind of the last step of the composing process, basically, is saying, now that it's in someone's hands and, they are breathing it to life, in this case, quite literally, what can they bring to the table now that is that little X factor that I didn't think of, or I would never have thought of, because I just don't play this instrument. I wouldn't have even known, like in the case of the earlier I think it was on Shawnee's with the cello going and the upper octave being a harmonic. If you know how to write for cello, that's not a particularly shocking thing to ask for, but it's the kind of thing that a great musician might say, I have a cool suggestion. What if instead of just fingering an octave leap, what if I just shift slightly, grab it as a harmonic, and then finger the E normally? And I've had so many sessions before where I was like, oh, yes, that's amazing. And then it's like, and I got 40 other places I can think of where we could apply that, and it can become almost a signature of the score. And it's the sad thing is, sad in quotes, I guess, is that people then hear it and say, oh, what a brilliant composer. I love that you thought to make that a harmonic. In Shawnee's case, actually is the correct attribution, but in so many of mine, it would be, credit to Tina or credit to whichever musician made that suggestion. It's a shame that I'm being given credit for their idea but that's to me the real joy of this. It's such a collaborative form. You're collaborating with game designers, you're collaborating with filmmakers, and then you're collaborating with musicians to let them bring something to it. So anyways, the more prescriptive the part, the less inclined the musician might be to offer those, because it looks like, okay, Jessica has very thoroughly conceived that, like, the phrases start kind of cold and unadorned, and then we end with maybe a little it's like hope, or it's sort of a warmth that emerges on the tail end of these phrases by vibrato, non-vibrato, segueing to vibrato. And they might look at all that and say, she's obviously put so much thought into this, I'll just play it as written. And you might have to literally conscientiously say, if you're interested, do you have thoughts on ways to do this differently? And because the musicians might say, actually, looking at bar 9 through 11, you have it as this kind of binary, 2 bars of non-vibrato and now a bar of ordinario. What if bar 10, I actually play with a very subtle vibrato so that it's a smooth transition and not a on again, off again kind of 0-1 binary switch. And that's the, but they might not necessarily feel welcome to offer that suggestion if the part is so thoroughly marked that it looks like, I don't dare mess with this thing that they've spent hours. It's just part of the classical / session musician training mindset. I think that because lots of sessions show up where there's barely even dynamics on the parts, and so they're asking questions all the time because they feel like, I don't even really know what to play. And the hard opposite of that would be, it's like a Corleone score or something where it's just absolutely marked to the extreme. And I try to aim in the middle of that, not because I have no opinions, but because I want them to automatically feel welcome. I'll always invite it openly anyway, but I really want them to feel like they're not a tool for me. They are an artist who I am asking and inviting to imprint their artistry onto the time that we have here together, and to make it more than I could have ever made it alone. Semi-related ramblings about what you have here. Do you have any other specific questions about it? Because it's a very nicely done piece. I think, especially knowing that you're sweetening, you may want to do these cellos in octaves, by the way, or you may find the intonation just the same thing I mentioned earlier about the strings in pairs can be very dicey in unison. It's very hard for them to agree, whereas 3 forms this kind of magic triangle. So you may find yourself asking cello 2 to tacit this, just as a heads up, starting at 31, for example. The 10th is like the magic interval for low strings. So, but anyway, that said, are there any other questions or things that are nagging at you about this, or just in general, before we pivot onward?
Well, I just want to say that I'm really glad that you brought up the thing about the guitar, because this is my first time writing for guitar, and as a non-guitarist, I was kind of just throwing notes out. So it's a very, very safe guitar part, I guess. So, but yeah, I guess when it gets recorded, then I'm glad that you brought up the fact that I am allowed to tell the guitarist what to do. Yeah.
Well, you are in charge. It is, in fact, your session. Even Mary Claire has no authority over you here. So, haha, you are muted. I love it. I see this is like, I feel like it's the Harry Potter newspaper, sort of silent yelling. Guitar, for what it's worth, I'm with you on guitar. I write for guitar all the time, and I find it perpetually terrifying because it's like this supercomputer with all these fucking weird tunings, and the fact that I'll write something really, really sort of complex, and they'll say, this is not playable at all. But if you remove this 1/16th note in bar 7 on the end of beat 3, the whole thing is easy for 20 bars straight. I'm like, no amount of my brain can calculate why the weird landmine was right there. And now suddenly and I spent all this time looking at fingering charts. I even have a couple of guitar. I don't play guitar, obviously, but I know how it works. I understand the sort of mechanics of what's going on, but just the sort of three-dimensional thinking of all the endless different ways that things can be fingered. Really masterful guitarists are just this bottomless well of suggestions of ways to approach things. And I find I accidentally write things unplayably hard all the time. Yeah, I actually have a funny example of that I can share. Let me see if I can find it really quickly, because I just my guitarist that I work with a lot messaged me the other day and goes, I honestly don't know how I did that, because I don't know how I would, like, he heard it and he goes, I don't even know how I fingered that, because that's crazy hard. And yeah, he did suffer. It's a thing I did for Valve for Counter-Strike years ago. Like, you know, it's the same thing. It's obviously a lot of doubling of mandolin and guitar, and it was, yeah. I have no idea how it's superhuman to me that he can do that, and same with the flute player. To be honest, Amy Tatum, that I love working with, because all that's written out, none of that's improvised. So it's just like a lot of these really fast run. Of course, flute players in general, wind players always have much bigger lung capacities than I'm expecting, and much more, so just like the crazy geometry of these fingerings is just one of those things my brain couldn't do if it depended on it, like with a gun to my head.
Those are pretty rough.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I have a strange. There's a few musicians that I work with that they're just so good that I love writing things that are borderline unplayably hard, because I know they'll be able to do it. And it's just fun. It's like evil, but it's fun. And yeah, so that's just one of those great joys of working with the same musicians over and over again, which I always encourage you to do as much as possible, is find folks that you can kind of constantly throw things their way, and they'll give you feedback on writing for the instrument as you just kind of grow as a composer. But then also you'll learn all the great, the certain registers, they sound really good, and the certain fingerings that they just have a real natural affinity for, all that kind of stuff. And then the caliber of your writing just goes up accordingly, because you're writing no longer just sort of generically a guitar part or a violin part or something like that, but it's for, XYZ musicians. And that's one of those things I've always derived particular joy from doing. Like I said, I've worked with Tina now for 15 years. We went to school together. And so, it's just like a long history of trying to find the line of what she can and can't do, and I have yet to break into the realm of the impossible. And I've been convinced I was there before, where I was like, okay, this is not physically possible on a cello, period. Even with like data or some superhuman android attempting these fingerings and double and triple and quadruple stops, and she's like checking her phone while she's playing it because she's not human. In any case, any last questions before we shift gears?
I think I'm good for now. Thank you. That was really helpful.
Well, I hope I get a chance to. I'll follow up with Torin and Mary Claire that I'd love to hear the final results of these recordings. To just see what they go through, especially given the conversations this morning about how to push the production element, because you have an interesting opportunity, since all of the individual instruments will be isolated, to potentially get in there and get your hands dirty on some interesting stuff. Like, I don't know if you noticed in the thing I just played, there's a lot of violin and it's quite distorted. And that was one of those where it was written originally as just a regular violin part. And then when she sent it over, I was just kind of bored by my own writing. And I just started cranking the distortion on the violin to see what would happen. Of course, I initially go way past the mark and it's just this wall of noise and horribleness. And then start dialing it in and automating the kind of how overdriven it is, and the sort of shaping and the coloring of it, and really starting to get in there. And before I know it, I had done quite a lot of work on just the violin. And if it was, if it was kind of an ensemble recording, there was no way you could do that without dragging everybody else along for that ride. So yeah, I'm a fan of breaking things apart and really letting the individual elements start to get a little weird. Yeah. All right.
Sound Toys is on sale right now for ridiculously, I think it's free for the next 30 days. So get Sound Toys.
Oh my God. Yeah, the sound, I mean, it's basically the best. If it was $1,000, it'd be the best $1,000 you ever spent. So the idea that it's free or cheap means it's criminal to not take advantage of that, because their plugins are just, it's amazing how powerful they are and how quickly you can get something sounding interesting.
True.
I have almost no mixes at this point without some decapitator in there. It's just essential.
Crystallizer too is the bomb.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You could hear it in all that Erica stuff. I love, actually, funny enough, in the Erica stuff, the crystallizer, I was using it on the whole orchestra on a few of the later cues, because I'm with you. It's just the best thing ever. And
it's so good on flute, Austin. Pro tip.
I have no doubt.
On flute, like 2 octaves up. It's like the most amazing sound ever.
If I can find the stem. Yeah, I mean, where's my bass ensemble? I wish I could remember which cue it was. Rushing through all these.
Well, we've gone quite far down the rabbit hole here, folks. And I need to sign off the YouTube channel really quick, and then we'll just keep on trucking because we're having so much fun here in Zoom. So really quickly, to all our friends at home, thank you for joining us. Let's give it up for Austin.
Oh, you're too kind.
We're clapping for you out there in the virtual realm.
I just had a kazoo in there.
For those of you that want to come back in a little bit to this YouTube channel for some more music and inspiration, we have a student curated Tiny Dorm concert that is starting at 5 p.m. on this YouTube channel, and then at 7 p.m. come back and we'll have a live demo and lecture from the acclaimed rap group Clipping. Austin will be back next Monday at the same time and place, and we hope to see you there. Thank you for joining. Go SFCM!
Yeah, surviving the apocalypse. Hooray.